Well, good morning. It's Saturday morning, and you have somehow found Bible Talk with Brent. I'm Brent, and we're gonna talk about the Bible, except this morning a little bit different because periodically along the way we're going to showcase a missionary whom God has used powerfully um, in changing the world. And it's about 110 in here, so I'm going to take my hat off. Uh, we do have some windows that my high-paid producer is going to open. Thank you, Logan. So this morning we're going to take a look at St. Patrick. And we all know St. Patrick, and probably most of us, especially if you've been around for a while, know when St. Patrick's Day is, March 17th. And I've often wondered, well, why is it March 17th? That happens to be the day he died in 461, quite a while ago. And so his story is really history because he God through Patrick changed the world for the better. And I think we can say that really about a lot of us, and even each of us individually. God chooses to use us, excuse me, in some way. Maybe not all of us are world changers, but we can at least change our surroundings, our community, our family, and so on and so forth. So St. Patrick he was raised in a little village in England, and his dad was a minor official in the Church of, I don't know if it was called the Church of England back then, but the church. And as you know, Ireland is kind of a neighbor to England, and the Irish never got civilized. And some might question if they ever did, but they're special in a lot of ways. And so, if you know any of world history, you know that the Romans came into England and civilized it up to Hadrian's Wall, which they built. And they built that to keep the Picts out because they were crazy. They would go into battle naked, painted blue, so that it freaked the Romans out. So they said, "Now we're building a wall here." So Roman roads, Roman culture was in England, and the Roman Church, which was established by Constantine's Edict of Milan in 312, and he basically flip-flopped the pagan temples into churches, and so all of the pagan gods now become saints, and that's kind of where all of the saints came from in as I understand it. Now, if you're a Roman Catholic, you may want to correct me in the comments. But so anyway, he wasn't especially that committed to Christ as by his own confession, and he wrote a letter called St. Patrick's Confession, which we still have a copy of it. And that's where most of this information comes from. Then the remainder comes from what we do know about history. So at 16, he is taken captive by the Irish slave traders. Excuse me. So at 16, a band of Irish slave traders sailed over to England and took a few hundred young men captive, kidnapped them, and hauled them back to Ireland. And he was sold to a Gaelic chieftain. And in Ireland at that time, they called the chieftain, they were all known as kings. So whereas normally you think of a king as being, the king of England, but I don't know how many they had like 30, 40, 50 different kings. And then if you got real powerful, you would become the high king. And you'd gather a bunch of these little enclaves together. Ireland at this time had no roads. They had no cities. It was just a collection of little warlords, you might call them, around, and they were always fighting each other. And so Patrick was a slave to one of them, and during this time he was there for 6 years. He learned Gaelic and learned the language. He learned the customs. Most of the time he was out in the wilderness tending this chieftain's sheep. And somehow, we don't know how, but he had a copy of the Psalms. At this time, if you owned a copy of anything, you were very wealthy, because to get a copy, that meant somebody painstakingly wrote out every phrase, every verse, and then put it on vellum. And so vellum was sheepskin that was scraped, made real thin, and that's what they wrote on. So it was very expensive, and to have a copy of the Psalms would have been a book about that thick. So we don't know that when um, the slavers stole or kidnapped Patrick, that he had one. He brought it. We don't know, but anyway, we do know that every night, every day, he would pray through the Psalms. And so when you go through something every day, eventually you memorize it, no matter how long it is. And I used to have a job of selling Time Life books over the phone. Worst job in the world. I think it lasted 2 weeks. But in that 2 week period, uh, we were selling a book on Seattle. And, hi, this is Time Life Libraries. And if you've ever gotten that call. But that was me for a while. But I had this big, long paper about small print I was supposed to read. And within 2 weeks, I had the whole thing memorized. Never tried. So anytime you spend enough time in the scripture over and over, day by day, week by week, year by year, you just get it memorized. And that's pretty cool, really. So Patrick called this his secret, spiritual secret, because man, he came alive for Christ in those 6 years. And to make a long story short, he escaped and had a rather circuitous route. We don't know exactly what happened, but he ends up back in England and becomes an official and a deacon, I think it was, in the church in England, until he was his early 40s, and he has a vision slash dream. I don't know if you ever had one of these, but it was so real and so vivid that it's like you're actually there. You wake up and it's like, wow, what was that? So in this dream, the Irish chieftain, and we don't know if it was the one he was subservient to, probably, hands him a letter. And the letter, he opens it up, and the letter says to the effect of, and the translation of these phrases are a little bit different, so you can read different accounts from it. They vary a bit. Was, "Come again, O holy youth, and walk among us." So Patrick says, well, God is calling me to be a missionary in Ireland. And he knew that it possibly could cost him his life. So knowing the culture, knowing the language, he heads to Ireland. Now, a year before, a fellow by the name of Palladius had been sent by Rome, the church in Rome, to help the Christians in Ireland. I don't know if there were some, maybe some ended up there, but Palladius didn't really accomplish much. So the next year, God sends the real plan. There's the plans of men and the plans of God. And the real plan was this kid, who got started long before Palladius as a slave in Ireland. So Patrick shows up, and over the next 30 years, from early 40s to 70s, he ends up planting 700 churches. 700 churches in 30 years. I mean, and the Spirit of God was powerful in Ireland. And it was so powerful that he also was making disciples. That's what we've been talking about. So his disciples were guys that wanted to be just like him. And, Paul says in one of the letters, he says, "Follow me, even as I follow Christ." In other words, to the extent you see me following Christ, follow me. Well, they did that. And he started monasteries, and I don't know if you know much about monasteries besides that brown cloak they wear and the hat, and they go around and tell people about stuff, carry a staff, some of the movies. But much more than that. So the monasteries were the center of learning, because the Irish didn't know anything. I don't even know if they had books, but I think they did. But so most of the time in the monasteries, they spent copying scriptures. So they would do this painstaking, and they would not only copy the scriptures, but you look at some of these early copies, and they're just intricately embellished with colors and scrolls and fancy stuff. Okay, well, so Patrick dies, and all of that was great. You might say in his final days, he could say, "Oh boy, God sure did something here." And that was true. But that wasn't the real focus of what God did in Ireland through Patrick and the people that followed him. So when he left, when he died, went to heaven, there were these monasteries around, and they were still cooking. The Spirit of God was still powerful there. And they all began to realize, well, the Lord he said to make disciples of all peoples. We better become missionaries. And so Ireland ended up sending out hundreds. I don't know if it was thousands, but I know it was many, many missionaries. And they were called peregrini, and that was a term for a mendicant, somebody who moved around. They took no money. They had that brown robe thing and their little hat and their staff, I would imagine. But they headed out to tell people about Jesus. And so one of them was a fellow by the name of Columban. He was a disciple of Columcille, who was, don't know, I think he was a disciple of Patrick. But anyway, this happened, 100 years later. Columban says he recruits 12 other guys because that's the biblical pattern, Jesus and the 12 disciples. So he recruits, so 13 people, and they build a boat. And the kind of boats the Irish had at that time were saplings or a green tree that you could bend. Then they wrapped it, and it was a round boat, didn't have a bow or a prow or anything, and it was wrapped in sheep hides or cow hides. I think probably more likely sheep that were stitched together, and then they would wrap the boat with tar, pitch, or whatever they could get to make it waterproof. So these guys get 3 days worth of provisions, and at low tide they go out as far out in the water as they can get, and at low tide and climb in and just sit there, and because they had no paddle. And, I mean, boy, this might help you understand the Irish a little more because, dang. So they had no paddle. They wait till the tide came in, picked the boat up, and then they would go out to sea.
Just float wherever.
Yeah, they would just float wherever because they said, God is in charge. He's going to send us where he wants us. So they land on the shore, which is currently Gaul, about 3 days later, and they head out and start telling people about Jesus. Now, why is this important? It's important because at this time, the western part of the Roman Empire is falling, disintegrating, because the barbarians have flooded in past the Rhone River. It froze over one year. That allowed all these thousands of barbarians to invade Rome. And at that time, everything Roman was bad. So Rome had, I think I read one place that Rome itself had 26 libraries in it. And there were great libraries around the Roman world. One was in Alexandria, one, of course, in Constantinople. That would be the Eastern Roman Empire. And they began burning libraries. And so over the next 100 years or so, the whole population, they lost the ability to read and write because they destroyed the schools. So when they call them barbarians.
Who destroyed them?
The barbarians did. The Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, that bunch. I guess they were pretty wild too. So, and at the same time, the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, Catholic simply means universal, was becoming more and more wealthy and more corrupt. And some might question if there was actually any real Christianity left in Europe at that time. And but hallelujah. Here comes the cavalry. The Irish show up and re-evangelize the church. And they also re-educate the church because Ireland had become the center of knowledge and wisdom, the center of scriptures. The Gutenberg printing press wasn't printed until well after this. And this is known, I think I mentioned, the Dark Ages and the plague and all those. It's just a terrible time of history. But thank God for the Irish, and thank God for Patrick. And thank God that he got kidnapped one night, which at the time seemed like a horrible, horrible thing. And thank God for 6 years, he was hungry and cold, but he discovered a spiritual secret, and it set the world on fire for Christ. That's pretty exceptional, but there's a lot of biblical examples of similar things like this, like Joseph, being sold into slavery by his brothers. But that's our...
You getting this from a book you read?
Oh, many books. The problem is that after Patrick, most of this comes from Patrick's confession. And then, of course, after his life, then there's many more historical documents that were recorded. But the problem with St. Patrick is that he was so revered and so renowned that there was all kinds of folklore about him. About he banished all the snakes um, from Ireland, and there's another one of him doing amazing healings and being wounded and being, healed right away. And so you have to filter out all of those to come up with pretty close to what actually happened. So if you become a serious student of Patrick, you're going to realize that all of the official um, accounts vary a little bit because there's quite a bit of supposition. If this, then this, and that must have happened like this. And sometimes they present that as true or accurate, factual, and it's really more of a supposition thing. So that's St. Patrick. We'll wait for.
You could also talk about the way we celebrate St. Patrick's today.
Yeah.
How debaucherous it is.
Yes, you think of St. Patrick's today, like in the big cities, and everybody's wearing green and getting drunk. You got green beer, and that's true because the Irish have always been, partial to grog or beer or whatever they brewed up. And mead, have you ever had mead? Did you know? Actually, I'm talking to my producer. We actually have a bottle of mead in the basement.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's like honey wine.
Yeah, it's made out of honey and.
Have you had it?
Never have. We should. We'll tell you what. On St. Patrick's Day next year, we'll have some mead.
Yeah.
In moderation. So I've never been much of a drinker. So that's it for this week. Sorry it's little bit longer. Hope you have found that interesting. And anyway, if you want to subscribe to us, that'd be great. We're up to like 2.5 subscribers. What are we up to? 11? All right, 11 subscribers. And so next week we'll get back into more of the Bible portion. We've been talking about disciple making. And so next week the subject will be, what is a disciple? If you're going to make one. And Jesus specifically entrusts us with a commission, or the command, I believe, to make disciples. And that's a specific thing that nobody knows much about anymore, unless you're involved with the Navigators, or a church or two that might actually be doing disciple making. And we're not talking discipleship course, that's just another course. But anyway, that's next week. What is a disciple? Have a great week. See you back in 7 days.